Open net pen salmon aquaculture has been operating along the west coast of Canada in the Discovery Islands for almost 30 years, and it was supported by the government. But not everyone was happy with the results that occurred in the surrounding waters. Indigenous groups and environmentalists were noticing that there was more disease in and outside of the pens and less wild Pacific salmon coming out of the Fraser River every year. A court ruled that many of the licenses for the aquaculture pens should not be renewed, and it's finally starting to happen. We're going to talk about all of this on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Today's a really interesting episode. This is a story that I've been wanting to do for a while. I've covered wild salmon and aquaculture salmon for a long time. This story that I'm covering today was actually on the Georgia Strait Alliance. I'm just going to let you know, it's probably slightly biased towards closing salmon aquaculture pens, and happy that the fish licenses haven't been renewed, which I'll talk about in just a sec. But I just wanted to kind of make you aware of that. It is slightly biased because the GSA, the Georgia Strait Alliance, is an organization that is within the Strait of Georgia, essentially, and it's between Vancouver Island and Vancouver, or the mainland of BC. This is where a lot of the sites were for aquaculture pens, especially the ones that are being taken away. This is a controversial subject. The open pen aquaculture salmon, Atlantic salmon that is done in the Pacific, has been controversial since it was first put in. There is a great podcast that I highly recommend called The Salmon People. It's a podcast series. It's very well told, very well done. A lot of information in there that kind of just dictates, from beginning to end, what's been happening with salmon, what's been happening with wild salmon, potentially giving way to why we see a decrease, or one of the reasons why we see a decrease in Pacific salmon, wild Pacific salmon, and why we are doing aquaculture for Atlantic salmon in the Pacific. So there are a lot of things that go on, and that story, that podcast, I don't know if there's another season to it, but the first season was fantastic. The people who are involved with it, I've covered it before, they just did a really good job, and it kind of shed light into a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today. But I highly recommend you take a listen to that podcast, because it's something that everybody in Canada and outside of Canada, especially if you're in the Northwest US, you're probably going through similar things that the people in BC are going through with open net pens for aquaculture salmon. And so I think it's really important. But this story here is talking about the closures of some of the licenses, or the non-renewal of some of the licenses, which will eventually close these aquaculture pens. So for the Federal Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard, Joyce Murray, so that's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, essentially, that includes the Coast Guard now. I used to work for this department in the Great Lakes. It's announced that it will not renew licenses for 15 open net pen fish farms in the Discovery Islands, upholding the previous direction that former Minister Bernadette Jordan established, but was set aside, ruling based on procedural fairness by the federal judge. So what that means is, it was actually supposed to be closed by all of the pens in the Discovery Islands were supposed to be closed by June 2022 last year. But in April 2022, a court ruled that the closing of the pens was just not in fairness to the organizations, to the companies, and it usually goes around the cycle of the aquacultured fish, from my understanding. I can't say this for sure because it doesn't say it in the article, but my understanding from when I listened to the aquaculture show, that Salmon People podcast, was the fact that, if the aquaculture pens, they want to get rid of all their fish first. There's probably a point where they can't put in new fish, or they can't raise and rear new fish, but they can get rid of their old ones and raise them to adulthood so they can sell them off and get rid of them. Because if not, what do they do with all those fish? You don't want to kill all those fish. You can't put them in the Atlantic Ocean. You'll never get there in time. And so what they do is they end up just selling them off and then finishing them up. So I assume that the decision to keep those pens going past that, in fairness to those companies, so they won't lose too much money, with the fish that they have now is to make sure that they sell off those fish, and then they're just at one point are not going to be able to do new ones. Now, of course, the way all this happened, the way the Salmon People podcast series was talking about, was the fact that a lot of these aquaculture pens were done in indigenous territorial waters, and the indigenous people did not want these aquaculture pens there. There was a lot of talk about and a lot of evidence showing that the fish in the aquaculture pens had sea lice and other diseases, but the government of Canada for years or decades did not acknowledge that. They had studies done, and there was an entire sort of commission called the Cohen Commission that showed and revealed that the government of Canada knew that there was some sea lice activity, to the point where there was sea lice on all these juvenile fish, which eventually got out of those pens. If you think about these pens, they're not closed off to the open ocean. They're open pens. So what happens is the fish go into these nets, these large nets. They go underwater. The fish are reared in these nets. They're packed within these nets. There's not much room for them to go anywhere. They start to get diseases, and it gets passed on quickly because there's nothing around, right? Like there's nowhere to go, and they're just kind of packed in there. Now, the feed that they're given, the food that they're given, the medication that they take, and all this kind of stuff is supposed to decrease the amount of disease that happens, but at some point it's just inevitable that it happens. And so what was being noticed was the fact that as these diseases were being found inside and outside of the pen, we started to notice a decrease in the wild salmon stocks over a number of years. And that's probably over the last 20, maybe even 30 years. So we're starting to see a decrease of the wild salmon population, Pacific salmon population. We're starting to see more diseases within the aquaculture pens and outside the aquaculture pens. But the government is not doing anything. The federal government is not doing anything, which had jurisdiction over this. But they're also managing it. And the interesting thing here about the federal government is it had a mandate to support fisheries, to support the aquaculture industry. So it took that mandate to heart. It didn't look at the science and say, hey, there could be a problem here. It looked at the science and said, hey, we're supposed to be managing and supporting this fishery, this aquaculture fishery, so we're going to do that. And they didn't really acknowledge people who were doing a number of studies. There was environmental groups, individuals who dedicated their entire lives to closing down these aquaculture pens based on science, not just based on, hey, I don't think it should be here for whatever reason. It's, hey, there's some diseases around here. It's affecting the ecosystem, and we need to do something about it. And they based it on evidence, and there's a lot of fighting going back and forth. There was a lot of spying going back and forth, whether it be through government, whether it be through the industry. It got dangerous at one point. And so there's a lot of conflict that went on between the environmentalists, with the environmentalists and indigenous groups who kind of teamed up together to help each other, as well as others that, against the government, basically, in the industry. So there was sort of two sides to these stories. Eventually, court battles and so forth and commissions led to closures of a lot of these pens, and there's still some that are open. But some of the quotes that are here from the Georgia Strait Alliance's biodiversity campaigner, Lucharo Gonzalez Ruiz, said that thank you to Minister Murray, who's the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard, for acting courageously to help wild salmon recover. And we acknowledge that this decision could not have been possible without the leadership and stewardship of local First Nations, which is the indigenous groups in the area. As the minister notes, this decision follows recent science and precautionary approach that points to open net fish farms as a threat to the already vulnerable health of the species. So the thing is, with the decrease of the wild salmon population, the Pacific salmon population, it's not only due to aquaculture, but it's not helping in their recovery. You have climate change factors, you have overfishing factors, you have the dams that block the rivers where a lot of them will actually spawn. There are a lot of things that are going wrong within, and you look at chemistry of the rivers, chemistry of the ocean. There are a lot of things that could affect the population of this wild salmon. But the things that we can control are the human sort of disturbances, and one of those is aquaculture in this case. Lucharo goes on saying, These same approaches must also apply to 60 plus other licensed open net fish farms in the rest of the coastal waters of the BC coast, where the wild Pacific salmon were also on the brink of extinction. All wild salmon need enhanced protections that fully remove fish farms on the waters to truly support their chance of recovery. Now, I want to just stop there for a second, because the one thing that was really interesting about the whole story around surrounding the Salmon People podcast was the fact that these licenses that are being shut down because they are in First Nation or Indigenous property. They're in the Indigenous territorial waters, and so the Indigenous people have the right to say, we don't want this in our territorial waters. If that happens, they have to take them out. And that's why these licenses aren't being renewed. Now, they had to work with the government to do that, and it took probably longer than they wanted, but they eventually got them out. The other 60 plus licenses that are not in First Nation or Indigenous territorial waters, that will be more of a problem to take them out, because there's an industry that's already established. There's a government that has a mandate to sort of enhance and help the fisheries of aquaculture. And usually the environment takes a back seat to the economy, takes a back seat to supporting jobs and so forth. So it's going to be tougher to get the other 60 plus licenses to stop. And some people just want aquaculture out of the Pacific waters in general, and that will be tougher to do from a policy level, trying to get the government to change, trying to get the government to not renew these licenses. They will really have to prove and almost go over, above and beyond what they normally do to say that that wild population salmon is being affected by aquaculture salmon. So they go on to say, at the Georgia Strait Alliance, we are eager to see federal government meaningfully support coastal and Indigenous communities as they navigate this transition away from open net salmon farming in the area, and manage the uncertainty about this industry's future in the rest of the waters of the BC coast. So it says here that with EcoJustice, our legal representative, and several allies, the Georgia Strait Alliance has been fighting to ensure the decision to phase out salmon farms in Discovery Islands and beyond remain on track with Minister Murray. So there's a new minister, as we mentioned earlier. And so EcoJustice, Georgia Strait Alliance, as well as other environmental groups, are really trying to make her stay on point and to say, hey, we need to get rid of these aquaculture pens, as it was stated in the court documents. Now, I don't remember exactly what all the court documents said, if they had to get rid of all of the pens, but that's going to be a tougher battle, I'm going to say right off the bat. Indira Azevedo, the staff lawyer for EcoJustice, said the minister's decision to not renew these Atlantic salmon farm licenses in the Discovery Islands puts front and center the ministry's primary duty to conserve wild Pacific salmon. So this is the choice: is do you preserve wild Pacific salmon, or do you preserve and uphold an industry that is causing other fish to decrease? That's basically what they're saying here. In the middle of the he goes on to say, in the middle of the biodiversity crisis. Did I already read that? Yeah. Margot Venton, a lawyer and nature program director at EcoJustice, said, in the middle of a biodiversity crisis, the minister's precautionary decision to limit fish farms in a key migratory route for highly vulnerable wild salmon populations is a critical step in giving wild salmon an opportunity to recover and thrive for the generations to come. Just to go back to the Discovery Islands, the Fraser River is right in the area, and during the salmon the Salmon People podcast, they talked about how, because the Fraser River comes right out there and the salmon go up the Fraser River, if the aquaculture pens are right by the river and there's disease in the area, then the juvenile fish are susceptible and vulnerable to getting these diseases as they go out to the ocean, not even getting a chance at an equal chance at life. So it's not even fair for those Pacific wild salmon juveniles that are going out. And so this is where we're at right now. In the Discovery Islands, we're stopping areas. I should mention that along the BC coast, there are several First Nation Indigenous groups that occupy those areas, that have those territorial waters, and they pack a lot of punch politically. We just talked about how Indigenous people were able to take out the pens in their territorial waters. So it'll be interesting to see how that was all divided out. Now, I should mention a number of years ago, I believe it was like 5 years ago maybe, there was a plan made, like a marine spatial plan along the BC coastlines, to acknowledge and to sort of delineate areas for different ocean users, right? It was a whole plan for the area. We've talked about marine spatial planning a number of years ago, probably at the beginning of this podcast. I'm very involved in marine protected areas. I always like talking about marine spatial planning and protected areas and planning the ocean just like we would plan land, right? We have a green plan. We have a green belt here in Ontario. Some of the government doesn't like it. We'll get that to another story, but we'll get that to that story another time. But when you have a plan to say, hey, this ocean user gets this access to this area, this ocean user gets access to this area, then you start looking at which of the areas, belong to which ocean users, which of them overlap, all that kind of stuff. You talk about compromise and all this kind of stuff. And they did that. They did that for 2 years. They went to different groups, not only indigenous, but to different ocean user groups, fisheries, recreational users, marine mammals, sort of vessels, like observer vessels, marine mammal watching vessels and that kind of stuff, that industry. And they talked a lot about different industries. They talked to different industries to talk about what the spatial plan is going to look like. They came out with the spatial plan, which included aquaculture. So when you're dealing with aquaculture in BC, you're dealing with the British Columbia government, which is the provincial government. You're also dealing with fisheries and oceans, right? And Environment Canada, but fisheries and oceans especially. They all have jurisdiction over certain aspects of the ocean. For a while, the province usually had access to the bottom, the ocean bottom along the provincial waters, and then the federal government had access to the water column. It gets really complicated politically, and when you look at it from the outside in, it really looks stupid to argue over these things. But there were arguments going on about putting in marine protected areas in certain areas because federal government didn't agree with provincial government about what was their jurisdiction and what wasn't, and it held up protecting biodiversity, protecting habitats within those areas, which to me is really, really idiotic. It's juvenile, but this is what happens when we talk about marine planning. Now that the province has a marine plan, it includes aquaculture, but the federal government is saying, hey, hold on a second, in indigenous areas, we shouldn't be putting, or we should leave it up for the indigenous people of that area that have control of that area, that have agreed upon territorial waters. They are the ones who make the decision if they want to keep it or if they want to get rid of it. What I loved about that Salmon People podcast, which I keep referring to, is you get to hear from the various indigenous groups. That was really interesting. To hear their pain when they saw sick fish, to hear how they felt when they didn't show that they realized they didn't have control over their own territorial waters, or to hear the fact that they lost ships, they lost fishery vessels because they couldn't fish anymore. Fishery vessels that were given from the previous generations to their generation, from father to son, from grandfather to grandson. These were the stories of a lot of these indigenous groups in the area who were just trying to live, by following their own cultural sort of standards. And they couldn't do that anymore. And a lot of it was due to disease. And so taking out these aquaculture pens is important for the indigenous people. Like I mentioned before, taking out the other aquaculture pens outside of the territorial waters will probably be very difficult, if not in some cases impossible. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you know a lot about the aquaculture industry along the West Coast? Do you know a lot on the the Northwest coast of the U.S.? Because it's very similar to that area. There are a lot of tribes in the area, different tribes in the area in the San Juan Islands, and aquaculture has been happening all over the place. We've had people on the podcast to talk about it, and I was trying to get someone on just as the New Year hit, but we just kind of lost touch. But hopefully we'll get back and we'll talk to them as well to see what the update is in the U.S. side of all of this. But I would love to hear your opinion on whether the aquaculture pens should remain in most of the BC waters or most of the West Coast waters, or should they just be removed completely? You can DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram. Or you can go to our website, speakupforblue.com. You can go to the Contact Us page. That page goes right to my personal email, or that whatever you fill on that form goes right to my personal email. I'd love to hear from you. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.